Hey Saints, we're back. The Lord sort of arrested me the other night here. Um, I was kind of doing a quick prayer, just saying, "Where would you have me study, Lord?" And I kept getting the sense it was supposed to be Jeremiah 4, which seemed a little bit random. But um, I was even doing some other things and was sort of stuck in my brain. And usually that's a pretty good cue for me to go make sure you go dig in, and I think it was really fruitful. Now, the premise of what I'm coming to, I don't want to say is doctrine or anything like that, because I think the whole thing's open for interpretation. But what I think I'm seeing here is Jeremiah 4, probably through 6, really might be an end time setting out of Jeremiah, which, if you guys know the history of the prophets, yeah, Jeremiah, spoke of end time things, certainly. Um, but I think these passages probably most frequently would be pegged as, prophetic passages that were about to happen in Jeremiah's day. So, Jeremiah was priest and prophet, around Jerusalem back in the 620s BC through the Babylonian sacking of Jerusalem in 586. And I was just reading up a little history. Potentially, as is recorded in Scripture, Jeremiah fled with a remnant into Egypt, and the history I was looking at said, according to Jewish tradition and writings, he was actually captured from there when the Babylonians came into Egypt, and he too was taken back to Babylon before his death, somewhere after or around 570 BC. So quite a long span of, him writing and that. So to narrow it down now, I started reading Jeremiah 4, and I was noticing a bunch of little tidbits that wouldn't maybe perfectly fit with fulfillment that really happened there in his day with Nebuchadnezzar, right, coming down into Jerusalem and in 3 waves, eventually wiping out the whole city and destroying the first temple. But there was a couple of little uh, things in here, and so I'm going to skip down a little bit and just show you some of the interesting things uh, that may or may not be pointing to these passages really being talked about the end times Antichrist and his army, who is also labeled the Assyrian, and we'll take a look in Micah 5, and there's other places where he's called that. And so kind of like the last video I did, Saints, where I was digging into the abomination of desolation, for instance, and looking at Daniel 11, and specifically, you guys remember there, I think it was verses 30 or 31 in particular, where that was picturing Antiochus Epiphanes, who, was a pretty perfect picture of the coming Antichrist. The commentaries all said that those verses in there related to Antiochus Epiphanes because it fulfilled this perfect stream of prophetic writings from Daniel. Few hundred years after he wrote it, it fulfilled in exactly the order, about 130, I think it is. Discrete statements can be picked out of the first half of Daniel 11 that were all fulfilled in exactly the right order in history. And verses 30, 31 are kind of right in that flow, and it does match up with Antiochus Epiphanes, but I think it was in verse 31 there specifically the abomination of desolation was mentioned. And the point, and maybe I didn't say this so well in that last video, but the point that struck me is Jesus himself said in Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, then the Jews are supposed to flee to the mountains. And so, Jesus putting in the future tense to his day means it couldn't be fulfilled with Antiochus Epiphanes back there, 167 BC. And, a little bit more context to that, Daniel spoke of the abomination of desolation 3 times, Daniel 9, 11, and 12. And Jesus never said, the abomination of desolation that was in, chapter 9. Of course, the chapter breaks weren't there, but in chapter 9, but not the one that was in chapter 11. He didn't put any criteria to it. And so even though everybody classically interprets Daniel 11, verse 30, 31 in there as applying to Antiochus Epiphanes, the fact that he quotes the abomination of desolation in there, to me says that Antiochus Epiphanes was that, near perfect type of the Antichrist, but the real deal was yet future. And that's why that video was kind of fun for me, is maybe a little revelation the Lord gave me amongst some other stuff in there, that that he was a pattern and not the fulfillment. And I think that's what this is here, saints. So we're not going to read all the way through. You guys would go board blind if I read you all the way through Jeremiah 4, 5, and 6. But I think that's an interesting study, and there's enough things in here where I think the sacking of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar might be another one of these. Yeah, it happened exactly as Jeremiah prophesied here in these 3 chapters, but there's enough cues in here to say, was that the final fulfillment? And that's kind of where my head went. So let's kind of get into this. Okay, let's set the context. So, if thou wilt return, O Israel, saith the Lord, return unto me, and if thou wilt put away thine abominations out of my sight, then thou shalt not remove. And thou shalt swear, saith the Lord liveth, in truth, in judgment, and in righteousness, and the nations shall bless themselves in him, and in him they glory. For thus saith the Lord to the men of Judah and Jerusalem, break up your fallow ground, and sow not among thorns. So he's starting with a call for repentance from the nation of Israel and Judah and Jerusalem in particular here. And now let's kind of skip down to some of this, interesting stuff. The lion has come up from his thicket. The destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. He has gone forth from his place to make thy land desolate, and his cities shall be laid waste without inhabitant. Gird thyself with sackcloth, lament and howl, for the fierce anger of the Lord is not turned back from us. So far that's tracking like what Nebuchadnezzar did, because was it 2 or 3 vassal kings were set up in Jerusalem after the first time that Babylon conquered Jerusalem, and yet Israel thwarted that, and finally he came in with the army and completely sacked Jerusalem and all. Let's skip down to 16, and here's where we start to get some interesting stuff. Make ye mention to the nations, behold, publish against Jerusalem that watchers come from a far country, and give out their voice against the cities of Judah. Now, that's probably just scouts that were sent out and all that, but I just thought that was a curious, watchers were sent out, and the definition doesn't help. It just basically says watchers. And I looked in here and tried to get the cross-reference, and there's 3 words that say watcher, and this one we're looking at, it's called natsar, to watch or to keep guard or watch over. And it's used in the Bible, but it's also used in Enoch and what was it, Jubilees. Um, and I wish I could get Enoch or Jubilees in Hebrew so I could just compare the word usage here, but it's of the words that are used for the watchers, the angel watchers. And I just wish, like I say, I could do the word study, but I just thought that was curious on there. And now let's jump over to Micah 5. So that picture that we saw of the God using, this is really the point, God using Babylon to come against Israel because of their unbelief and it being time for judgment is why this is occurring. Now let's go take a look at Micah 5. Okay, Micah 5. Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that is to be the ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been from old, from everlasting. Therefore he will give them up until that time which she travaileth hath brought forth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return unto the children of Israel. We'll stop there. This travailing with child is a marker for the end times, okay? And he shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord and in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. For now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. And that's, Jesus' reign after the second coming, right? Is when he will be great to the ends of the earth. And this man shall be the peace when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces. Then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And there's that curious reference to the Assyrian in an end times context. Now, the Assyrian was Nimrod, and that's why, a lot of these videos we do, we kind of take a look at the stuff from the beginning appears to return at the end of the Bible, and this is one indication of that. And the cities of Assyria, which Nimrod founded or ruled over, are there up in Iraq, right? The Babylon area and all this, and where the Tower of Babel was. But then, he's called the Assyrian, the actual, what do I want to say, the Nebuchadnezzar invasion would have been coming out of the land that was, known as the land of the Assyrians, even though it was the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so you can see that here now. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he cometh into our land and when he treadeth within our borders. And we see that that's, Babylon has fallen. Was it Babylon has fallen, and you see that in Revelation 17, I want to say. And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, as dew from the Lord, and showers upon the grass, and tarrieth not for man, nor waiteth for the sons of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among flocks and sheep, who, if he go through, both treadeth down and teareth into pieces, and none can deliver. And this is, interesting also because the dew used symbolically in the Bible is resurrection. And so here you see, probably after the second coming, a picture of the restoration of the Old Testament saints here in type and shadow, or actually in symbology. Thine hand shall be lifted up upon thy adversaries, and all thine enemies shall be cut off. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that I will cut off thy horses out of the midst of thee, and I will destroy the chariots. I will cut off the cities of thy land, and throw down all thy strongholds. I will cut off witchcrafts out of thine hand, and shall have no more soothsayers. The graven images also I will cut off, and the standing images out of the midst of thee, and thou shalt no more worship the work of thy hands. and I will pluck up the groves out of the midst of thee, and I will destroy thy cities, and I will execute vengeance and anger and fury upon the heathen, such as they have not heard. And there's kind of the final, second coming kind of a picture. And so you can see here this, little bit of the end time picture in Micah, where we're a little bit more confident of, it's the Assyrian king, it's Nimrod, and I think that's what we're seeing now in Jeremiah 4, even though it is what happened with Nebuchadnezzar back in the 500-600s BC time frame. All right, let's go down a little bit more in Jeremiah 4. I just want to show you a few more things here. You always stop at curious verses, right, saints? We've done this enough where you go, why is that in here? And here's a classic one. So I'll roll into this a couple of verses before I get to 23. How long shall I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? For my people is foolish. They have not known me. They are sottish children, and they have none understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. Now, listen to this transition. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. And I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. And when you look that up, it's all the hills moved back and forth. And I beheld, and lo, there was no man. And all the birds of the heavens were fled. And I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. I think I'm going to keep going here for a few more. For thus saith the Lord, the whole land shall be desolate, yet I will not make a full land. For this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above be black, because I have spoken it. I have purposed it. I will not repent, neither will I turn back. The whole city shall flee for the noise of the horsemen, the bowmen. They shall go into the thickets and climb upon the rocks. Every city shall be forsaken, not a man dwell therein. And when thou art spoiled, what will I do? Thou clothest thyself with crimson, thou deckest with ornaments of gold, that thou may rentest thy face with painting, and vain shalt thou make thyself fair. Thy lovers despise thee. They shall seek thy life. For I have heard a voice as of a woman in travail, there's the marker, and anguish as of her heart, that she bringeth forth her first child. Who is that? And the voice of the daughter of Zion, that bewaileth herself, that spreadeth her hands. Woe is me, for my soul is wearied because of murderers. And there's just so many cool things in here. I'm just going to pull out a couple of things. So the first one here is, it's in the context of judgment, and then it's like this really severe transition. Behold, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. Now that is, and some of you guys probably have done this before, without form, tohu, and void, bohu. And if you don't know why that's significant, it's part of this really big debate that goes back to Genesis 1. So here, let's go back to Genesis 1. Looking at verse 2. And the earth was without form and void. Tohu, bohu. It's, it's an uncanny requoting. And let me give you the theory here, and we'll look at one other passage probably too before we close this one off. But I think what Jeremiah is doing here is he's comparing this oncoming Nebuchadnezzar onslaught to Jerusalem as a complete destruction, the way that the earth was completely destroyed in days of old. And now you say, no, that those Genesis 1 verses are about the creation of earth. And that's where you get some, can't make doctrine out of this, saints, but there's some really curious stuff going on in Genesis 1, 2. I'll just show you this because it'd be it is a whole nother video to show you a bunch of verses that only, in my mind, makes sense if there was something before Adam and Eve, which, okay, now some of you are gasping and, heading for the door. Just hang on just for a minute. And I'll show you just one of the curious things here. And the earth was without form and void. And again, a word study. And the earth was a primitive root to exist, that is to be or become, to come to pass. Okay, so it's speaking of a destruction here that makes it without form and void. And I'm not, this wasn't a revelation to me. Chuck Missler teaches this, and going back to the 1800s, there's people that taught this. And all I'm trying to say is, if that's the case, I think this is pretty interesting, because what Jeremiah might be doing here is comparing that complete and utter destruction, because here, everything was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And that's really the same language actually that Jeremiah is using here in 4, is complete destruction. So I'll just leave that to you to think about. There's a passage in Isaiah, I guess I wrote it down here too, we can take a look at Isaiah 45. These are rabbit trails, but I think this is going to be interesting when we get to it. 45:12. So here's Isaiah. I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host I have commanded. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for a price or reward, saith the Lord of hosts. Now that's Jesus, right? Jesus is going to rebuild the city and release the captives. Thus saith the Lord, the labor of Egypt, the merchandise of Ethiopia, and the Sabians, men of stature, shall come over unto thee, and they shall be thine, and shall come after thee in chains. They shall come over, and they shall fall down unto thee, and they shall make supplication unto thee, saying, surely God is in thee, and there is none else. There is no God. We're going down just a few more verses here. Verily, thou art a God that hidest thyself, O God of Israel, the Savior. They shall be ashamed and also confounded, all of them. They shall go into confusion together that are makers of idols. But Israel shall be saved in the Lord with everlasting salvation. You shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth, and he made it. He established it and created it not in vain. Well, there's that same word, tohu. Okay, he created it to be inhabited and not in vain. And so when people want to go talk about this world that maybe existed before, the Adam and Eve creation part, here in Isaiah 45, he's saying he formed it and he made it not in vain. And right away in Genesis 1 verse 2, he said the earth was formless and void, using the exact same word. And so God created a perfect creation in this, line of thinking. There was a judgment, God judged completely, and there was no man, remember? And I think that's a curious reference as well the Jeremiah account, and then Isaiah. There was no man in Jeremiah 4, and the birds had fled and all that. And so what am I coming to? Well, I'm coming to that Jeremiah, yeah, he was talking about Babylon being taken in the day. He was seeing that, but really the final fulfillment of this is the end times, Nimrod, the Assyrian, coming into the land of Israel. And we know he does this, in Zechariah 12 and 13. 13 talks about how 2/3 of all the Jews are taken either into captivity or killed. And so I think that's what he's picturing. He's talking about total destruction, and he's talking about the scope of this as being like when the whole earth was judged back in Genesis 1 is really what he's probably pointing to. So let's keep going on this. I know that, for people that haven't heard about this possible scriptural support for an eon or an age before Adam and Eve, it's there, but don't make doctrine on that. It's, what if somebody someday proves without a doubt that there had to have been life before 6,000 years ago, or whenever we put the marker for Adam and Eve? The Bible, in my mind, doesn't clearly rule that out. Now, God made his unique creation in those 6 days in Adam and Eve, but was it potentially a recreation? Just like, and again, I think the Bible shows cycles. What do you see at the end in Revelation 21 and 22? God creates a new heaven and new earth. And for people that study that, they realize that God also promised that the earth would never pass away. And so he must be talking about a recreation at the very end of the Bible, just like we might have had a complete recreation at the very beginning of the Bible. And those patterns, to me, seem to fit fairly well, but I would never say that that's doctrine. Okay, and so here's the interesting thing then. We've got all the mountains and hills moving back and forth, and there was no man, and that's why I think this might be a reference to that judgment pre the creation of man. And all the birds of heaven were fled, and behold, the fruitful places were a wilderness, and the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. Well, we know that the Jeremiah was about to see the first big judgment against Israel for their apostasy with the destruction of the temple and all that. And so this being in the reflecting mode here with the fruitful places turning into a desert, right, and the cities broken down, could be an explanation for why we have things that appear to be older than what the Bible creation of man account. Some say the pyramids are older than 6,000 years. Some people say, the Baalbek stuff is probably older than that. And I want to keep going here, but there's an interesting scenario that I think we could kind of paint, and it's this is, what if, because we don't know when the angels fell, and we know that there was Nephilim in the land, for instance, before and after the flood, but we don't know how far before, and you get curious artifacts. I think it's called the King's List, that a real ancient Sumerian King's List, and it recounts kings that had rule for tens of thousands of years, and then right at the time of the flood, boom, the kings had these normal lifespans again, and historians have used that tablet as historically accurate moving forward from the flood, but they say, well, that stuff beforehand must have been a myth. Well, we see, whether you think about the gray aliens now or the genetic engineering we're doing now, that's the program of Satan, is genetic tampering. And that's recounted in Jubilees and hinted at in Enoch and all that That's what the fallen angels were doing, is they were messing with God's creation and messing with the genetics. And you get those stories like, you know, humans were must have evolved out of Africa, and you know, because of, you know, there's patterns of civilizations that are super old. And then people talk about, you know, the people that believe in this, the aliens coming and seeding the planet. There's the story, I don't know if it's a Sitchin story or what, but that they started in Africa as slaves. They're created as slaves to the master race. And there's, you know, writing presumably that's used to recount that. Here's what was rolling through my brain. What if what if before the fall of the angelic host, you know, with Satan and all, what if they were tampering with the genetics of God's creation way back in an age prior to Genesis 1 verse 2? And, you know, they tampered and created a man-like being to be their slaves, because that's their story, and we know there's a great deception coming. And I think the only way there'll be a convincing deception that the aliens seeded the earth, or the aliens we believe is part of that grand deception, would be that there's historical evidence of this. And when we know that, you know, there's the Miatas out of India and all that, and a lot of archaeology that sort of records these ancient beings interacting with Earth. What if that was the fallen angelic tampering in an age before man was created? And I was just thinking that would be a perfect, yeah, I don't want to say joke, but a perfect twist of fate. If when then God created man, he created something like what the fallen angels were using as their slaves, and he created man, but he put his spirit in them. Wouldn't that be the thing that would burn Satan? Is this thing that they were trying to do to create slaves for themselves? God flips on its head, and he puts his spirit within them. And then we know that the angelic hosts of heaven are ministering spirits to us, to the saved. That would be a huge twist of fate. But again, I stepped way off the reservation because I was in these really curious passages in Jeremiah 4 that point to a destruction potentially. Well, it's definitely before Jeremiah's time, and potentially there's a destruction coming globally that fits this pattern as well. And it's one of these curious things. It just sits right in here, you know, where God says he's going to judge his people, and yet the whole earth was without form and void. Well, that didn't happen when Nebuchadnezzar came in to the land of Israel. So this passage has to be speaking to something else. And I think it's pointing to the degree of destruction in the original Genesis account, where the earth was without form and void, and we know that it wasn't created that way from Isaiah 45. And I think he's saying the destruction when Nebuchadnezzar comes in is going to be that complete. But I think the final fulfillment here, my point of Jeremiah 4, 5, and 6, is the end time version of Babylon coming in to Jerusalem, God using that as a judgment against his people, because we saw that there, and he's judging them for apostasy and for taking up soothsayers and the like. And that's actually stuff we were just studying a few weeks ago. We'll get down to that in Amos and what we looked at in Daniel. So I don't know, saints, I just, when I read these things, I think, well, the classic interpretation is Jeremiah is living at the time when Nebuchadnezzar comes in. But how do you explain the insertion of these verses at a minimum? And then we get some of these other pointers, like I said, that we read the, toward the end here about the woman being in travail, right? So that's an end times kind of a reference. And well, let's kind of move on here. I just want to point these things out. Okay, so we'll finish off 4 with this last verse. For I've heard a voice as of a woman in travail, and anguish as of her that bringeth forth her first child, and the firstborn of Israel, right? That's, Jesus was the firstborn, right? Voice of the daughter of Zion. And I looked up this daughter of Zion. A lot of people talk about daughter of Zion as also an end times reference. And I actually got into gotquestions.org and looked up daughter of Zion. You can go repeat that process. And a lot of the verses did apply to the end time regathered Israelites being the daughter of Zion, but it looks more like, a term of endearment for when God's embracing his people. And so that isn't as strong of a marker of the end times as the woman being in travail. And that's kind of, another one where I thought, this can't just be Nebuchadnezzar coming in, to collapse the city in 586 BC. Something else is going on. All right, let's go pop over to 5 here. Okay, here in 5, now he's kind of going on again he's admonishing, Israel for abandoning him and for going into harlotry with these other gods. And so, how shall I pardon thee for this? Thy children have forsaken me, and sworn by them that are no gods. When I fed them to the full, they committed adultery, and they assembled themselves by troops in the harlots' houses. They were as fed horses in the morning, every one neighed after his neighbor's wife. Shall I not visit thee for these things, saith the Lord? Shall not my soul be avenged on such a nation? Go up ye upon the walls and destroy, but make not a full end. Take away her battlements, for they are not the Lord's. For the house of Israel and the house of Judah have dealt treacherously against me, saith the Lord. They have belied the Lord and said, Is it not he? Neither shall evil come upon us, neither shall we see sword or famine. And the prophet shall become end, and the word is not in them. Thus shall it be done unto them. Wherefore saith the Lord God of hosts, because ye speak this word, behold, I will make my words in thy mouth of fire, and the people wood, and shall devour them. Lo, I bring a nation upon you from afar, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. It is a mighty nation, it is an ancient nation, a nation whose language thou knowest not, neither understandeth what they say. Now, it's an ancient nation, and there you go. I mean, Babylon at the time of Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar was still, an ancient nation, because you'd have to go back, to the Babylon after the flood, 1400 years or whatever before this, to come to the first Babylon at the time of Nimrod. So maybe that's what that's about. But notice, because the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar was just to the southern kingdom, this is another one of those curious things. Lo, I will bring a nation upon you from afar, O house of Israel. And generally, that's in reference to both Israel and Judah were the two when it was split north and south, and this is house of Israel. So I'm not sure, but it's definitely not specific to just Jerusalem, right? So and Judah. So I'm thinking this is just one more indication that this is pointing us toward the end time judgment with the Antichrist coming in, because it's against the whole house of Israel. Okay. And the quiver is an open sepulcher. They are all mighty men. And again, this, you can't make doctrine out of this one, but it's one more curious thing. Mighty men is Gabor, which is frequently associated with the Nephilim. It's not always, but frequently associated with the Nephilim in the Old Testament. All right, and then we skip down to 19. And it shall come to pass when they shall say, Wherefore doth the Lord our God all these things unto us? Then shall ye answer them, Like as ye have forsaken me, and served strange gods in your land, so shall ye serve strangers in a land that's not yours. And yes, Jerusalem went captive into Babylon, but we did a video a while ago. Jerusalem's going to go captive into Babylon again. Amos 5, I think it says, beyond Damascus, talks about captivity again in the end times in Daniel 11, 30, 31. And there was another clear reference I had, I think it was in Micah before, when we talked about the captivity in the end times of Jerusalem, the city going into captivity. And so that fits, this pattern's the same here. They're going to go into a land, and it said for many days, I think, in Daniel 11 there, and that's kind of what this is pointing to as well. Declare this to the house of Jacob, publish it to Judah, saying, hear now this, O foolish people, and without understanding, which have eyes to see and not, and which have ears to hear and not. And that's always been the judgment, right, that Christ pointed to. Okay, I'm going to skip down now to verse 24. Neither they say in their heart, let us now fear the Lord our God, that giveth rain, both the former and the latter rain. That's reminiscent of Joel 2, isn't it? He reserveth unto us the appointed weeks of the harvest. And I went, man, there's another curious little reference. So, you know, you guys, you get all this when you go looking. The weeks is Shabuah, and where we heard Shabuah before, and that's in Daniel 70-week prophecy. He reserveth unto us the appointed weeks of the harvest. And so I just thought that was a curious reference there. All right, let's skip over now. We're just cleaning up here this thought. 6 and 14. They have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people, slightly saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And isn't that exactly what you see in 1 Thessalonians 5 there in the first 11 verses? Then sudden destruction comes upon them. It's like a quote out of there, right? And then in 20, something else that's curious. To what purpose cometh there to me incense from Sheba and sweet cane from a far country? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable, nor your sacrifices sweet unto me. Well, that is right out of Amos 5, where he says he detests their sacrifices and all that they're going to do in this third temple. And so again, all these things, yes, they had a fulfillment during the time of Jeremiah, but there's definitely some indicators here that was just a pattern potentially for the end time final fulfillment, and that's what I think is so fun about this stuff. Okay, then a couple more curious things and we'll wrap it up. Thus saith the Lord, behold, a people cometh from the north country, and a great nation shall be raised up from the sides of the earth. Well, again, you know, the time of Jeremiah, the north country, you know, the people that came and took Jerusalem and Judah was Babylon. So it was a kingdom in a region in the world, and yet this one, there's this curious raised up from the sides of the earth. So we know that the end times Babylon has a nation, you know, worldwide, you know, conquest. And so I just think these things are interesting. And then we finish off Jeremiah here in 6 with the 24, and I heard the fame thereof, our hands wax feeble, anguish has taken hold of us as pain in a woman in travail. And there you go, that reference again. And then in 26, O daughter of my people, gird thy with sackcloth, wallow thyself in ashes, make thee mourning as for an only son. And, you know, where do we learn that they mourn for his only son? That's Zechariah, I want to say. Most bitter lamentation, for the spoiler shall suddenly come upon us. And so I just thought that was neat. I don't think you'll find a commentary, if you do, that says that this is an eschatological set of 3 chapters. Yeah, it would be cool for me. Send it to me. This is what the Lord was pointing out to me, though, is the resources I looked at talked about Jeremiah 4, 5, and 6 in terms of, you know, Jeremiah's lifetime and what happened with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians sacking uh, Jerusalem and Judah, which they did, and burning down the temple. And yet there was just enough things in here that started sending me off in all sorts of directions, thinking this really might have a final fulfillment here as the end times. And so for me, that just became fun. So God bless you, saints. We just keep plugging on as best we can, and see you upstairs soon, I hope. God bless.